Play the recording, I said, before anyone in that courtroom could decide who I was for me. The room went still, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, and for the first time in weeks, I saw uncertainty flicker across my son's face. 3 months earlier, none of this would have made sense. I had a routine, a quiet and steady life that I trusted. I woke up at 6 every morning, brewed my coffee the same way I had for years, and read the news at my kitchen table while the sunlight came through the blinds. I managed my own bills, drove myself to appointments, and kept a calendar that was neat enough to impress anyone who ever doubted me. There was nothing remarkable about it, and that was exactly how I liked it. Then Lucas started showing up more often. First, it felt thoughtful. He brought groceries I did not ask for, insisted on organizing my medications even though I had never missed a dose, and reminded me about appointments I had already written down. He smiled more than usual, spoke slower than necessary, and used a tone that sounded gentle but felt misplaced, like he was talking to someone else entirely. I told myself he was just worried. Children do that sometimes when they think their parents are getting older. But the small changes kept stacking up. He started answering questions directed at me, cutting in before I could finish a sentence, correcting details that were not wrong. "Mom gets confused sometimes," he would say with a polite laugh, even when I was standing right there. At first I brushed it off thinking it was harmless. Then I noticed how often he repeated it. To the pharmacist. To a neighbor. To a friend on the phone. The same phrase over and over like he was planting something. One afternoon, I went to my doctor's office for what I thought was a routine checkup, but the conversation felt different. The questions were longer, more pointed. They asked me to recall lists, repeat phrases, draw shapes on paper. I answered everything calmly, but when I asked why the appointment felt so unusual, the nurse gave me a look that lingered a second too long. "Just a standard evaluation," she said, but her voice carried a kind of caution I had never heard before. On the drive home, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not fear exactly, but a quiet uncertainty that settled in my chest. That night, I opened my calendar and double-checked everything. Every appointment. Every bill. Every note. It was all there exactly where it should be. I had not forgotten anything. I knew that. But the next day, Lucas came by again, and this time he brought paperwork. He said it was just for peace of mind, something temporary, something that would make things easier in case I ever needed help. He talked about safety, about protecting me, about making sure no one could take advantage of me. His words were careful, reassuring, but they did not match the look in his eyes. There was something else there, something calculated. I asked him directly why he thought I needed any of it, and for a brief moment he hesitated. Then he smiled again and said, "Mom, you have been forgetting things lately." It was such a simple sentence, but it landed harder than anything else he had said, because it was not true. And yet, somehow it was starting to become real to everyone else. Over the next few weeks, the pattern repeated itself. Conversations shifted when I entered the room. Phone calls ended abruptly. Neighbors who used to stop and chat now offered quick smiles and kept walking. It was subtle, almost invisible if you were not paying attention, but I was paying attention. I could feel the space around me changing, like the world was quietly agreeing on something I had never said. And that was when I realized this was not concern. It was a narrative. And it was being built piece by piece right in front of me. I did not confront Lucas again. Not yet. Instead, I listened. I watched. And I started to ask myself a different question. Not what is wrong with me, but what is he trying to make everyone believe? Because somewhere in all of this there was a reason. And whatever that reason was, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was not losing my mind, but someone was trying very hard to convince the world that I already had. I began to notice how carefully everything around me was being arranged, not in obvious ways but in quiet, deliberate shifts that only stood out when I paid close attention to the pattern. Lucas did not push anymore, not directly. Instead, he started letting other people do it for him. A neighbor I had known for over 10 years stopped by with a concerned expression and asked if I needed help remembering my grocery list. The pharmacist double-checked my name twice and spoke slowly as if I might not understand him. Even my own doctor, who had always treated me like a capable adult, began explaining simple things in a tone that felt rehearsed. Each interaction on its own could have been dismissed, But together they formed something else entirely, something coordinated. I tested it one morning by arriving early to an appointment and sitting quietly in the waiting room. I listened as the receptionist spoke on the phone, her voice low but clear enough for me to catch certain phrases. She mentioned my name, followed by the words memory concerns and family reports. I felt a chill move through me, not because I was confused but because I was not. I knew exactly what I had heard. When I stepped forward to check in, she looked startled for a split second before forcing a polite smile. It was subtle, but it confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. This was no longer about observation. This was about documentation. Later that afternoon, Lucas came by again, carrying that same calm energy that now felt less like kindness and more like control. He asked how my appointment went, and before I could answer, he gently filled in the blanks himself, suggesting I might not remember all the details. I let him talk. I watched the way he chose his words, how he framed everything just slightly off from reality, close enough to sound believable but far enough to change the meaning. That was when I made a decision. I stopped correcting him. I stopped defending myself in those moments. Instead, I let him believe that I was accepting his version of events. It was not easy. Every instinct told me to push back, to prove him wrong, to show that I was still in control. But something deeper told me that reacting would only feed the story he was building. So I stayed quiet, and in that silence I started to observe more than I ever had before. I noticed how often he checked his phone after speaking about me, as if reporting something. I noticed how certain conversations only happened when I was in the room, like they were meant to be overheard. I noticed the timing, the consistency, the way everything aligned too perfectly to be accidental. One evening I walked into the kitchen earlier than usual and heard Lucas speaking on the phone in a low, serious tone. He did not see me at first, and for a few seconds he spoke freely. He mentioned paperwork, timelines, and something about ensuring the evaluation results supported the case. The word case stood out. It did not belong in a conversation about concern. When he finally noticed me, he ended the call quickly and smiled, asking if I needed anything. I shook my head and said no, but inside something shifted completely. That was the moment I understood this was not just a misunderstanding or an overreaction. This was a plan. And plans leave traces if you are patient enough to follow them. That night, I sat at my kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet, staring at the same calendar I had trusted for years. Everything on it was still accurate, still clear, still mine. But the world around it was changing, and if I did nothing, it would continue to change until I no longer had a say in it. I thought about how easily a story can become truth when enough people repeat it. I thought about how quickly doubt can replace certainty when it comes from the people closest to you. And I realized that if Lucas was building something piece by piece, then I needed to do the same. Not by arguing, not by convincing, but by collecting something that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted. Something that would speak for itself when the time came. I did not know exactly how it would unfold yet, but I knew where to start. Because if he was relying on words to shape reality, then I would rely on something stronger. Something that could capture the truth exactly as it was, without distortion, without interpretation, and without permission. I did not act immediately because acting too soon would have ruined everything. Instead, I gave it time, not because I was unsure, but because I needed certainty that could not be questioned later. The next morning, I went about my routine exactly as before, making my coffee, reading the news, writing down a few notes in my calendar, all the small details that defined my normal life. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen nothing unusual, and that was exactly the point. Lucas arrived around noon, carrying the same calm expression that now felt practiced. He asked simple questions, the kind that sounded casual but were clearly designed to test me. He asked what day it was, what I had for breakfast, whether I remembered an appointment from earlier in the week. I answered each one correctly, but I noticed how he reacted, not to my answers but to how quickly I gave them. There was a slight pause, almost disappointment, before he smiled again and nodded as if everything was fine. That was when I understood that my accuracy was not what he wanted. He needed inconsistency. He needed doubt. So I gave him something else. I slowed down my responses just enough to seem uncertain, not enough to be obvious, but enough to fit the narrative he had been building. It felt unnatural at first, like stepping out of my own identity, but I reminded myself that this was not about proving who I was in that moment. It was about protecting who I would be allowed to remain in the future. Over the next several days, I continued the same approach. I listened more than I spoke. I allowed conversations to unfold without correcting every detail. And most importantly, I started to prepare quietly. I purchased a small recording device during a routine trip to a local store, choosing one that was simple and easy to conceal. I did not rush to use it right away. Instead, I waited for the right moment, because I knew that one clear truth would matter more than a dozen unclear ones. That moment came sooner than I expected. One evening, Lucas invited someone over, a man I had not met before, dressed in a way that suggested professionalism without warmth. They spoke in the living room, assuming I was upstairs resting. I moved slowly, carefully, positioning myself just close enough to hear without being seen. My heart was steady, not racing, because I had already accepted what I might hear. The conversation began with polite formalities, but it quickly shifted. They discussed timelines again, evaluations, and something about presenting a consistent picture. The man asked if there had been any resistance from me, and Lucas responded with a calm confidence that felt unfamiliar, almost rehearsed. He said I had good days and bad days, that sometimes I seemed clear but other times I struggled. He spoke about managing my finances soon, about making sure everything was handled responsibly. There was no anger in his voice, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that made everything feel more real than I wanted it to be. That was when I activated the recorder. I did not move, did not interrupt, did not react. I simply let the truth unfold in their own words. They spoke about legal steps, about how documentation would support their claims, about how important it was that everyone involved remained consistent. The word consistent came up more than once, and each time it carried the same meaning. This was not about my health. It was about maintaining a story. When the conversation ended, I returned upstairs the same way I had come down, quietly and without drawing attention. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the small device in my hand, feeling its weight in a way that went far beyond its size. It was not just a recording. It was the first piece of something solid, something that could not be reshaped or reinterpreted. For the first time since all of this began, I felt a sense of control returning, not because the situation had changed, but because I had changed how I was approaching it. I was no longer reacting to what Lucas was doing. I was documenting it. And that difference meant everything. Because if he believed he was building a case, then he had no idea that I had just begun building one of my own. By the time I had gathered several recordings, I understood that what I was facing was no longer just a private situation between a mother and her son. It had expanded into something formal, something that was already moving toward a legal conclusion whether I agreed with it or not. That realization did not frighten me the way it might have weeks earlier. Instead, it clarified what I needed to do next. Evidence without direction is just noise, and I needed mine to mean something when it mattered most. Lucas became more confident with each passing day, and that confidence showed in the way he spoke around me. He no longer softened his tone as much, no longer hesitated before making assumptions about my memory. In fact, he began speaking about my condition as if it had already been confirmed, even though no one had ever shown me anything official that supported it. One afternoon he sat across from me at the kitchen table and explained that there would be a court hearing soon. Something routine, something meant to help organize things for the future. He said it calmly, as if it were already decided, as if my agreement was just a formality. I nodded slowly, allowing just enough hesitation to appear in my expression, and asked a simple question about the date. He answered without suspicion, and in that moment, I realized that he truly believed I was no longer capable of understanding the situation. That belief was his greatest weakness. After he left, I took out my calendar and wrote down the date of the hearing, underlining it once, not out of habit but out of intention. That was the moment everything became real. Up until then, I had been observing, collecting, preparing. Now, I had a clear endpoint, a place where everything would come together. Over the next week, I reviewed every recording carefully, listening to each one more than once, paying attention not just to the words, but to the tone, the pauses, the assumptions that revealed more than direct statements ever could. I began to notice connections between conversations that I had not seen before, patterns that stretched across different days and different people. The same phrases, the same strategies, the same quiet insistence on maintaining a consistent story. It was all there, layered and repeated until it formed something that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. I knew I needed someone who could understand how to present it properly, someone who could see what I was seeing and translate it into something the court would recognize as truth. But I also knew I could not approach that step carelessly. If Lucas discovered what I had been doing, everything could change before I was ready. So I moved carefully, choosing a moment when he was out of the house longer than usual. I made a call to a legal office I found through a simple search, asking only for a consultation, nothing more. I kept my explanation brief, neutral, careful not to reveal too much over the phone. The appointment was set for 2 days later. When I arrived, I carried the recordings with me, not physically obvious, but present in a way that gave me a sense of grounding. The attorney I met listened without interruption as I explained what had been happening, how the narrative had been built, how the evaluations had been framed, how the conversations I had recorded revealed something entirely different from what was being presented. When I played the first recording, I watched his expression shift, not dramatically, but enough to tell me he understood the significance. He did not rush to conclusions, did not offer immediate reassurance, but instead asked precise questions that focused on clarity rather than emotion. That was exactly what I needed. By the end of the meeting, he explained that what I had gathered was not just useful, it was critical, but timing would be everything. He said the hearing would be the moment where it mattered most, where the contrast between their claims and my evidence would be impossible to ignore. As I left his office, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel yet. Not relief, not victory, but readiness. Because for the first time since this began, I was not just reacting to what was happening around me. I was preparing to change it. After meeting with the attorney, I understood that preparation was no longer just about collecting evidence, it was about precision, timing, and restraint. Everything I did from that point forward had to align with a single goal, not to confront Lucas too early, not to reveal anything that would cause him to adjust his behavior, and not to disrupt the version of events he believed was working in his favor. That required patience in a way I had never practiced before. I returned home that evening and found Lucas sitting in the living room, reviewing documents on his tablet. He looked up and smiled, asking casually where I had been. I answered simply, saying I had gone out for a walk and stopped by a store. He nodded without suspicion, and in that moment, I realized just how completely he had accepted his own narrative. To him, I was no longer someone who could plan, analyze, or act independently. That assumption gave me space, and I intended to use every bit of it. Over the next several days, I followed the attorney's guidance closely. I organized the recordings in chronological order, labeling each one with the date and a brief description of what it contained. I listened to them again, not as someone trying to understand what was happening, but as someone preparing to present it clearly. I paid attention to clarity, to moments where the intent behind the words was undeniable, to sections that showed coordination rather than concern. Each piece was important, but some were stronger than others, and I began to understand which ones would carry the most weight when it mattered. Lucas, meanwhile, became even more comfortable discussing the situation openly, especially when he believed I was not fully engaged. He began making more frequent calls, sometimes stepping into another room, but often staying within earshot as if he no longer saw the need to hide anything. I recorded what I could, always careful not to overreach, always aware that one careless moment could undo everything I had built. One afternoon, he sat across from me again, this time explaining more details about the upcoming hearing. He spoke about it as a necessary step, something designed to ensure my safety and stability. He mentioned legal guardianship in a tone that suggested it was already a formality, something that would simply be confirmed rather than decided. I listened quietly, asking a few simple questions that reinforced his belief that I did not fully grasp the implications. Inside, however, I understood every word. Guardianship would mean losing control over my finances, my decisions, my independence. It would mean that everything I had built over a lifetime could be managed by someone else, based on a narrative that was never true to begin with. That realization did not create fear. It created urgency. The hearing was approaching, and with it, the moment where everything would be tested. The attorney contacted me once more before the scheduled date, reviewing the plan in careful detail. He explained how the evidence would be introduced, how the timing would be critical, and how important it was that I remain consistent in my presentation. He did not ask me to perform or to prove anything beyond what was already clear. He only asked that I remain calm and allow the evidence to speak when the moment came. That instruction stayed with me. I did not need to argue. I did not need to convince. I only needed to reveal. The night before the hearing, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the same place where all of this had begun. My calendar was open in front of me, the date underlined just as I had written it days earlier. Everything was in place. The recordings were organized. The plan was clear. And yet, the weight of what was about to happen settled in quietly, not as doubt but as awareness. This was the point where the story that had been built around me would either hold or collapse. Lucas believed he had already shaped the outcome. He believed the narrative was strong enough to stand on its own. What he did not realize was that for every version of the truth he had repeated, there was now a record of what he had actually said. And those records were not open to interpretation. They were not influenced by tone or assumption. They were exact. As I closed my calendar and turned off the lights, I felt something steady and unshaken settle into place. I was no longer waiting to see what would happen. I knew exactly what would. After meeting with the attorney, I understood that preparation was no longer just about collecting evidence, it was about precision, timing, and restraint. Everything I did from that point forward had to align with a single goal, not to confront Lucas too early, not to reveal anything that would cause him to adjust his behavior, and not to disrupt the version of events he believed was working in his favor. That required patience in a way I had never practiced before. I returned home that evening and found Lucas sitting in the living room, reviewing documents on his tablet. He looked up and smiled, asking casually where I had been. I answered simply, saying I had gone out for a walk and stopped by a store. He nodded without suspicion, and in that moment, I realized just how completely he had accepted his own narrative. To him, I was no longer someone who could plan, analyze, or act independently. That assumption gave me space, and I intended to use every bit of it. Over the next several days, I followed the attorney's guidance closely. I organized the recordings in chronological order, labeling each one with the date and a brief description of what it contained. I listened to them again, not as someone trying to understand what was happening, but as someone preparing to present it clearly. I paid attention to clarity, to moments where the intent behind the words was undeniable, to sections that showed coordination rather than concern. Each piece was important, but some were stronger than others, and I began to understand which ones would carry the most weight when it mattered. Lucas, meanwhile, became even more comfortable discussing the situation openly, especially when he believed I was not fully engaged. He began making more frequent calls, sometimes stepping into another room, but often staying within earshot as if he no longer saw the need to hide anything. I recorded what I could, always careful not to overreach, always aware that one careless moment could undo everything I had built. One afternoon, he sat across from me again, this time explaining more details about the upcoming hearing. He spoke about it as a necessary step, something designed to ensure my safety and stability. He mentioned legal guardianship in a tone that suggested it was already a formality, something that would simply be confirmed rather than decided. I listened quietly, asking a few simple questions that reinforced his belief that I did not fully grasp the implications. Inside, however, I understood every word. Guardianship would mean losing control over my finances, my decisions, my independence. It would mean that everything I had built over a lifetime could be managed by someone else, based on a narrative that was never true to begin with. That realization did not create fear. It created urgency. The hearing was approaching, and with it, the moment where everything would be tested. The attorney contacted me once more before the scheduled date, reviewing the plan in careful detail. He explained how the evidence would be introduced, how the timing would be critical, and how important it was that I remain consistent in my presentation. He did not ask me to perform or to prove anything beyond what was already clear. He only asked that I remain calm and allow the evidence to speak when the moment came. That instruction stayed with me. I did not need to argue. I did not need to convince. I only needed to reveal. The night before the hearing, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the same place where all of this had begun. My calendar was open in front of me, the date underlined just as I had written it days earlier. Everything was in place. The recordings were organized. The plan was clear. And yet, the weight of what was about to happen settled in quietly, not as doubt but as awareness. This was the point where the story that had been built around me would either hold or collapse. Lucas believed he had already shaped the outcome. He believed the narrative was strong enough to stand on its own. What he did not realize was that for every version of the truth he had repeated, there was now a record of what he had actually said. And those records were not open to interpretation. They were not influenced by tone or assumption. They were exact. As I closed my calendar and turned off the lights, I felt something steady and unshaken settle into place. I was no longer waiting to see what would happen. I knew exactly what would. The morning of the hearing arrived with a kind of stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if everything had slowed down just enough to make each moment more defined. I woke up at the same time as always, followed the same routine, and made my coffee the same way I had for years. There was comfort in that consistency, a reminder that despite everything that had been said about me, I was still exactly who I had always been. Lucas arrived shortly after, dressed more formally than usual, his movements precise and controlled. He spoke to me in a tone that suggested reassurance, explaining that everything would go smoothly, that the court would simply confirm what was already understood. I nodded, allowing a slight hesitation to remain in my expression, reinforcing the version of me he believed he would present. Inside, however, I was completely steady. The drive to the courthouse was quiet. Lucas focused on the road, occasionally glancing at me as if checking for signs of confusion or anxiety. I gave him nothing beyond what he expected to see. When we arrived, the building stood exactly as I imagined it would, structured, orderly, and indifferent to the stories that would be told inside it. We walked through the entrance, past security, and into a waiting area where other people sat quietly, each carrying their own situation, their own version of truth. My attorney was already there, standing near the far wall, reviewing a folder with calm focus. When he saw me, he gave a small nod, not one of reassurance but of readiness. That was enough. We took our seats and I placed my hands calmly in my lap, aware of every detail around me without reacting to any of it. Lucas spoke briefly with his own attorney, their conversation low but confident. There was no urgency in their tone, no sign that they expected anything other than a straightforward outcome. That confidence remained as we were called into the courtroom. The room was smaller than I had imagined, but it carried a weight that came from its purpose rather than its size. Everything inside it was designed for clarity, for decisions, for conclusions. We took our places, and the proceedings began with a series of formalities that moved at a steady, controlled pace. Lucas's attorney spoke first, presenting the case with a calm authority that mirrored everything I had heard in the recordings. He described concerns about my memory, about my ability to manage daily responsibilities, about the need for structured oversight to ensure my well-being. The language was careful, measured, and consistent. It was exactly the narrative that had been built over weeks, now presented as fact. As he spoke, I remained still, listening without interruption, allowing every word to settle into the room. I did not react, did not challenge, did not correct. That was not my role in that moment. My attorney spoke next, his tone different, not louder or more forceful but precise. He did not argue against every claim. Instead, he focused on clarity, on the importance of evidence, on the need to distinguish between perception and reality. He asked the court to consider not just what had been said, but how it had been said, and whether the foundation of those statements could be verified. The shift in the room was subtle, but it was there. The focus moved from assumption to examination. Then came the moment I had been preparing for. My attorney requested permission to present audio evidence, explaining that it would provide direct insight into the situation, as it had actually occurred. There was a brief pause, the kind that signals a transition, before the request was granted. I felt Lucas shift slightly beside me, not dramatically, but enough to indicate that something unexpected had entered the process. I did not look at him. I kept my gaze forward, steady and unchanged. The first recording was prepared, the device connected, the room quiet once again. And in that silence, I understood that everything that had been carefully constructed was about to be tested against something that could not be reshaped or explained away. Because for the first time since this began, the truth was not being described. It was about to be heard. The recording began without introduction, Just voices filling the room in a way that felt immediate and undeniable. Lucas's voice was clear, steady, and unmistakable, speaking in the same tone I had heard so many times before, but now there was no context to soften it, no framing to reshape its meaning. The words carried themselves direct and complete. He spoke about timelines, about making sure everything aligned, about how important it was that evaluation supported the case. There was no mention of concern, no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was deliberate, structured, and focused entirely on outcome rather than truth. The second voice joined, asking questions that revealed even more, not challenging the plan but refining it. They discussed consistency again, the need for every report, every interaction, every observation to match the same narrative. As the recording continued, the room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer neutral. It was attentive, focused, shifting in a way that could not be reversed. I did not move, did not look around, but I could feel it. The weight of the words was settling in a way that no explanation could interrupt. When the first recording ended, there was a brief pause, not from confusion, but from recognition. My attorney did not rush to speak. Instead, he allowed that moment to exist, to fully register before moving forward. Then he introduced the next recording. This one was from a different day, a different conversation, but the pattern remained the same. Lucas spoke about managing my finances, about transitioning control, about how the process would appear straightforward once everything was in place. Again, there was no sign of concern for my well-being, only a focus on execution. The repetition was not accidental. It was reinforcing. Each recording added another layer, another confirmation that this was not a misunderstanding or an isolated statement. It was a plan repeated and refined over time. I could sense the shift beside me without turning my head. Lucas was no longer completely still. The quiet confidence he had carried into the room was beginning to fracture, replaced by something less certain, something that could not be controlled through explanation alone. His attorney spoke briefly, attempting to reframe what had been heard, suggesting that the conversations were being interpreted out of context, that they did not represent the full picture. The argument was measured, careful, but it lacked something that the recordings had provided effortlessly. It lacked clarity. My attorney responded by introducing one final piece, not as a surprise but as a conclusion. This recording was shorter but more direct. It captured a moment where Lucas spoke openly about ensuring that I appeared inconsistent during evaluations, about how small hesitations could reinforce the impression he needed to establish. There was no ambiguity in those words. They were not influenced by tone or interpretation. They were exact. When the recording ended, the silence returned, but this time it carried a different weight. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that follows when something becomes undeniable. The narrative that had been carefully built over weeks had just been placed beside the reality it was meant to replace, and the difference between them was clear. My attorney spoke again, not with emotion, but with precision, pointing out the consistency in the recordings, the repeated focus on maintaining a specific story, and the absence of genuine concern in any of the conversations. He did not need to exaggerate or emphasize. The evidence had already done that. I remained still, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, not because I was unaffected, but because there was nothing left to prove through reaction. Everything that needed to be said had already been heard. And for the first time since this began, the story that had been told about me was no longer the only one in the room. The truth had entered, not as an argument but as a record. And records do not adjust themselves to fit a narrative. They reveal it.